Good evening. It's nice to be back at the podium at the New York Studio School. Some of you are aware of the fact there's about 5 of us who've written books on the end of something. Anyway, mine was the art world, and that was actually 13 years ago, which is quite some time. Okay, this is a topic that I have been involved with for a number of years, beginning back in 2000 at the Gwangju Biennial. Can you hear me okay? Does it sound all right back there? When I was invited to give a talk, Gwangju is in South Korea, and I hadn't planned to talk about globalization, but it just came out in one of my remarks. And there was a Korean scholar who astutely said, when you say globalization, what you really mean is Americanization. Is that correct? And that set me on a at least more than 1 decade journey of unraveling the meaning of some of that. Okay, first I'm going to tell you what this talk will not be. It will not be a survey of emerging artists in the international market. It will not be about promoting artists for a potential market. It will not be a talk about art appreciation. The images I will show are not works of art. They are reproductions of art meant as indices, here used as reference points by which to introduce some ideas and speculations as to problems in confronting connoisseurship today, right now. Instead, I will talk about how to regain the ability to evaluate works of art, bereft of mentioning artists' names and prices. I will talk about understanding art at a moment in history, this moment, as cultures are being virtually effaced and replaced by the overwhelming omnipresence of media. It will be about rethinking the importance of acknowledging the quality of life through experience, in contrast to a mindless materialism and arrogant execrations that have gradually come to erase the respect for dignity, conversation, feelings, and taste in art. I'm going to begin with an image that I'm sure most of you know by Robert Motherwell. This painting was in an exhibition I saw in 1965, curated by Frank O'Hara at the Museum of Modern Art, and I never forgot it. What attracted me at a very young age to Motherwell was a certain spontaneity, yet at the same time a precision in terms of how he dealt with the spontaneous gesture. I felt that he had a way of contextualizing scholarship in relation to art. He was influenced by what was happening in Spain in 1937, the Spanish Civil War, the fight against fascism, which took a remarkable courage on the part of many of those people, and which somehow connected with Motherwell, and he ended up doing over 200 of these paintings called Elegy to the Spanish Republic. He once mentioned in a lecture at Carpenter Center at Harvard in 1967 that this lecture was about the death of a romanticism that would probably never come again, which gave me the clue that he was indeed a romantic with a strong classical bent. Several years after that lecture, I wrote a letter from Southern California to Motherwell saying, I think I would like to talk to you because I know nothing about art. And it was true. I knew nothing about art. And you know something? I still don't know much about art. But anyway, he sent me a letter back a week later, handwritten, and it said, here are my 3 phone numbers. when you come to New York, call me. So 2 months later, I took my life in my hands, drove across a snowstorm in the Southwest, finally made it 7 days later to the Brooklyn Bridge with my dog, and I put a dime in the phone, and I said, "Hello, this is Robert Morgan," and it was Helen Frankenthaler on the phone. I recognized because I'd done my homework. And she said, "Mr. Morgan, we've been expecting you." And I said, "Really?" And she says, "Yes, can you come over tomorrow at 11:30? And I said, "Well, I think so, but I have to check my schedule." So I hadn't had a shower yet, so I went over to a friend's, had a shower, ended up sleeping on the floor in his apartment. And Motherwell was just incredibly generous as I went to their home and studio up on 94th Street. And after 3 hours of talking, Helen came in and said, "Robert, you've got to get your car to the airport." He was having his first show at David Mirvish's in Toronto that evening. And Motherwell said, "Helen, I'll take the next flight. I want to talk longer with this young man, me. You know something? That's why I'm here right now." That changed my life. That somebody believed in me enough to cancel a flight and talk an hour longer. Anyway, one of the points that was raised in that conversation is more germane to what I'm going to talk about tonight. Motherwell talked about his publishing and his scholarship, which was very impressive, that someone who was an artist, a painter in fact, could also be a scholar. And he showed me a copy of Circle magazine, and I noticed that there was an article by John Cage. And I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Motherwell, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the ideas of John Cage are very different from yours." And he said, "Yes, that's true. I have a different point of view. But what I'm going to say to you is also important, and that is John Cage's ideas are important, whether they're my taste or not." I never forgot that. And I guess, being naive at the time, I understood later that most of the art world does not possess that kind of generosity. Particularly when I arrived in the late 70s, everyone wanted to talk about what they did. No one wanted to talk about anything that might be interesting other than what they did. And I decided that I wanted to split my career between being a writer and critic and being a painter. Obviously, the first part has taken over the second. Anyway, I'm going to just show an image of Cage because often people don't recognize how incredibly beautiful some of these scores are. This was a score that he did, I believe, in 1958. Yes, it is. It's a concert for piano and orchestra, 1958. It deals with all the issues of indeterminacy, aleatory music, in other words, chance operations, and his influence, of course, at that time was very strongly Zen Buddhism, which also interested me a lot. Around that time, maybe a little later, 5 years later, I was at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and there was a sale in the bookstore, and they were selling this huge portfolio of facsimiles of paintings from the late Tang to the Ming Dynasty. And I had to spend $25 for that book, which I really couldn't afford. I'm so happy I bought it because it was the beginning of my interest in East Asian art, in China, in Korea in particular. Now, I'm showing you a painting by a monk who was working during the late Tang Dynasty, and his name is Hua Yisu. Hua Yisu. Buddhism was in China by this time, and we saw the beginning of the split between institutional connoisseurship through court painting and the emergence of monk painters, self-trained outside the institution, using what is called the wild cursive script, which is what you see here. Often the ideograms are enshrouded in this lyrical line and superb craftsmanship and sheer intuition. The concept of connoisseurship in China goes back to the Han Dynasty, which was the 2nd century AD, the ability to ascertain quality in a work of art through empirical observation and knowledge of the object, and through an identification with the spirit or energy, the qi, being transmitted through the work. We're looking at one of the greatest painters of the Northern Song Dynasty, Li Chen. This is Solitary Temple and Clearing Peaks from the 10th century, the late 10th century. Painting is the highest of the arts, and ink is its life's blood. Landscape started to become accepted as a genre unto itself during the Northern Song Dynasty, independent of a narrative. It was the beginning of what contemporary curator Gao Ming Lu, who I was with a week ago in Pittsburgh, sees as metaphysical painting, which is the origin of abstraction in Chinese art. In other words, abstraction has never really been separated from what Westerners might call representation. We can call this an Eastern idea, but it might be worth considering this in terms of some forms of Western abstraction as well. In other words, this is not concrete, although John McLaughlin may disagree, but it's a way of seeing and transmitting. Okay, I'd like to digress for a moment as we look at this reproduction of an extraordinary ink painting. This is an incredible obverse perspective where the mountain seems to be right over us. It's extraordinary. We have to change the idea that because an artist performs like a mirror to society, it is supposed to be profound or important. The idea of art is to take us to another level where we begin to ask questions we never thought to ask. This also raises the question of originality in art. Has there ever been an artist who has not been influenced by someone else, or from a Chinese perspective, by observing something in nature? On the other hand, it is difficult to insist on either originality or influence when it comes to one artist borrowing from another. The critic Rosenberg once asked, "What is new in art?" The tradition of the new. Perhaps we could say that syntax is the basis of originality, not the material object apart from everything else. Yet there is a difference between influence and affinity in the history of art. Often influences are imposed on artists or civilizations in a way similar to imposing the verdict of guilt without adequate proof. Whereas influence is often conjured in order to justify one's research, in actuality there is only a trace of a sustaining link between the research and the proof. In such cases, skepticism or doubt remains the more adequate and justifiable conclusion. Even today, in the age of the internet, it is not always possible to prove a cause and effect relationship. While I would propose that much of the rhetoric used to sustain originality and influence is superfluous, as postmodern theory made clear, there is one sustainable idea from postmodernism I find important: that we live at a time of suspended opposition without resolution, other than on the level of pure idealism. In essence, we might say that art that represents symptomatic media rarely becomes significant art. Media runs its own circular course, while art runs another, ultimately more involved with history. So then, what is significant art? We're looking at a celadon washer in the shape of a hibiscus from the Southern Song dynasty, which comes after the Northern Song. And this is dated roughly the late 12th, early 13th. Now, in reference to this extraordinary celadon vessel, I had an experience in 2002 at the Shanghai Art Museum, which is often called the Ding, which is a bronze bell. Some of these, by the way, these bells are on exhibit in the Age of Bronze that was during the Chu dynasty in China, and they're being shown at this moment at the China Institute, an exhibition I would highly recommend. Anyway, when I was at the Ding, or the Shanghai Art Museum, it's because the shape of the museum is that shape, I saw a number of small jade objects, and they went back beyond the Shang dynasty, which is 3,500 years ago, beyond the Neolithic period, beyond the Paleolithic period. I saw a Jade Cicada, which is a representation of a cricket, dated more than 50,000 years ago. And my first response is, how do I account for this in terms of myself being alive at this moment? What was the motivation that inspired or motivated or incited someone to carve this cicada? This further raises the notion of understanding the difference between the artist as a media logo and the actual importance of the work itself. What I'm trying to say is, we don't know who carved that cicada, and in fact, we don't know who made this extraordinary celadon washer, which is a kind of vessel with a lid for washing. We don't know the name of the person. We don't know the price. But we do know that the proportions of this are incredible, that the surface is absolutely precise. The celadon is nameless, anonymous, but it exists as a significant work of art. It is time to stop being breathless after a future that is already in front of us, and to start measuring the importance of contemporary art with relation to a perspective on the past. I ask the question, is the Dangling Heart by Koons really so much greater than a major painting by Haim Soutine, an École de Paris master, who sells for 1/4 the price? The case for connoisseurship is given to the act of observation and analysis of the actual work, the feeling of the object, whether or not a name is attached. Most of you will recognize this as the Parthenon. Most of you probably don't know that it was built by an architectural cooperative called Ictimus and Callicrates Incorporated. It took 9 years to build, from 477 to 438 BCE. In terms of its basic structure, it stayed intact almost for 2,100 years. In spite of the transformation into a Byzantine church, active between 1208 and 1458, many of the dukes from Frankfurt used to go there for some reason. I discovered that. I don't know what it means, but they went there. Then it was transformed into a Turkish mosque and largely destroyed by a Venetian bombardment on September 26, 1687, which is where the majority of the damage was done. A shell from the Venetians hit a powder keg being housed inside the mosque for some reason, destroying 14 of the 46 columns in the peristyle, the columns surrounding and supporting the roof, and it destroyed most of the interior. Of course, the history of destruction and desecration goes on. But today, we may think of the Parthenon as a ready-made, appointed as a work of art, expressed in ruins, now with polychrome floodlights on the columns in the evening. It was the Temple of Athena where it served the masses. In other words, people went there as a kind of gathering place. And it still serves the masses as an emblem of the tourist trade, a competitor to the Eiffel Tower in Paris. Now, this occurred to me when I was doing my Fulbright in Korea. I was lecturing at Seoul National University, and I was asked to do a two-part lecture on Marcel Duchamp. And so I started thinking about what other ready-mades may have been around before 1913, when Duchamp put the bicycle wheel on the stool that you see on your left. The second ready-made was, in fact, the bottle drying rack from 1914. Both of these were selected in Paris. One was an assistant ready-made, the first, in fact, where a bicycle wheel is installed on top of a stool, thus creating a double negative, which means a positive, as in electric current. The wheel no longer propels the bicycle, and the stool is no longer available for sitting. Art becomes functionless at this moment. Also, it exists in time, and in time, just like the Parthenon, it's going to change. What we're looking at, in fact, is one of the Schwartz edition from 1964, of which 8 copies were made of each of the 12 major ready-mades. What about conceptual art and connoisseurship? I suppose I mention this question because some of you may know that I did the first dissertation on conceptual art at NYU back in 1978, which was later published as a book in 1994. However, I am no longer there. Anyway, I continually go back to the question, or questions I should say, that intrigue me because I've always been on both sides of the fence. Is the idea of a conceptual art idea and connoisseurship a contradiction? Is it an oxymoron, like, for example, military intelligence? Or is it possible that they can find a happy meeting ground? My accountant used to say, when your taxi driver starts talking about investments, it's time to move in a different direction. I would say, when you see conceptual art advertised as a course in an adult ed program in the subway, it's time to rethink the importance of conceptual art. Still, I would have to agree that for a revival of connoisseurship to occur, aesthetics needs to pass through the window of conceptual art. What do I mean by this? We're looking at Entente Donnée. It was a collaboration between Marcel Duchamp and his wife Alexina, who worked on it with him for 11 out of 21 years. I would say this: the ability to accept that art can exist as an idea, and that even in such an art there can be a criteria of excellence, is important. But that criteria will be different than other more stable or material forms of art. My argument is that connoisseurship today cannot continue on the same ground it has stood on in the past. At the same time, it is necessary that we find a new language for connoisseurship. The art market cannot continue to float in the astral zone of names and prices without aesthetic gravity. It needs a new ground, a new way of seeing that can accommodate significant art in the present, as it will continue to admire the great art of the past. I love the statement by the Italian Florentine conceptualist Maurizio Nannucci, who said, "Remember that all works of art were at one time contemporary." Does this mean that for art to remain significant or qualitative, whatever term you choose, it must be contemporary? I think it does. This means that if you ever get to the caves outside of Saint-Tropez in southern France, which have been dated 32,000 years, which is Paleolithic, of course, they seem contemporary. They feel contemporary. I suppose, if pressed, I could find work in West Chelsea or in Williamsburg that is not so far from these Paleolithic caves. Here are a couple of examples that work in a different way. The first has a sobering commentary by the early 20th century German art historian Heinrich Wölfflin, who was one of the great connoisseurs of the 20th century, who influenced Berenson, among others. I'm going to quote this passage in relation to the Donatello on the left and the Verrocchio on the right. These, according to Wölfflin, represent the peak of the Quattrocento. Quote, "The contrast can be readily appreciated if Verrocchio's bronze David is compared with the same figure by Donatello. The sturdy youth has become a fine-limbed boy, yet lean enough to display the precise form with a pointed elbow deliberately set akimbo, so that it is included in the main silhouette. All the limbs are in tension, the leg outstretched, the knee straightened, the sword arm taut. How strongly this contrasts with the calm arrangement of Donatello's figure. The whole motive is developed so as to create an impression of movement, and movements now sought for even in the expression of the head. for his smile flickers over the feature of the youthful victor. The taste for ornament is gratified by the details of the armor, which subtly both follows and interrupts the graceful lines of the body. And if one examines the treatment of the nude, Donatello's summary handling seems almost empty compared to the wealth of detailed forms in Verrocchio. A sobering commentary on two works of art, on a period in history, on the apogee of a period in history, that one would welcome to hear today. A financial market needs a standard evaluation or a criteria, or it's lost. It seems obvious to me that this is also true for an art market. The question I propose is, where are the standards? Here I turn to Clement Greenberg's famous essay from 1972, which is in my book of selected essays in the late period after 1970. Can taste be objective? Now, of course, Greenberg falls in line with a sequence of formalist art historians, including Wolflin, of course, who he acknowledges, and Roger Fry in the 20th century. Formalism is a 20th century art historical methodology. It's very important to recognize that it's an art historical methodology, not a prescription to make art, which is how it was later interpreted. Not by Greenberg, of course, but by those who misunderstood Greenberg. The problem of, in that essay, Can Taste Be Objective? Greenberg concludes by saying that consensus was enough to ensure the objectivity of taste. Now, I think the problem, although I like the argument, but the problem is the word taste. Although it comes from Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, its meaning, I think, is a little different today, certainly in English, than in German, because it often, at least to my mind, refers to something subjective, more connected with cuisine or fashion, for example, or even a film, a Hollywood film, let's say. And I think that if Clem had used the word subjectively, then it would have made sense. But to talk about it in terms of a criterion is something else. Now, Clem shied away from criteria. He didn't like to explain himself. He didn't like to analyze because he felt it was too academic and inappropriate. And as we know, experience was the main point. Either you feel something or the analysis is not worth the time. This is Greenberg's point, particularly as he moved along in his career. He never liked to defend his taste other than through the eye. As in the phrase, he has a good eye. And I would ask, because I'm more postmodern than Clem, does that mean that she has a good eye also? As much as I admired and grew to love Clem, it was clear that he would never bring the market or the ploys of the market, advertising and promotion, into a discussion on art. Unfortunately, history has moved in another direction, where the eye has married the brain, and the marriage is unlikely to disappear. Yet despite the rhetoric and the discourse that surrounds the marriage, which I believe to be necessary for connoisseurship, there is most essentially an ability to look at great art. In other words, I agree that the experience is the basis by which one begins to make an evaluation and an analysis or interpretation. By the way, I often use the term significant art as opposed to qualitative art, because significant art suggests that as a modernist, we have gone through the window of conceptual art and come out the other end. In other words, there's a willingness to embrace the possibility that some ideas, framed in the right perspective, could exist as art. But we're not going to stop going to the object. The object still reigns in terms of something that can give the kind of experience that most people are looking for. What a great painting at the National Gallery in London. Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne. It was commissioned by Alphonse d'Estre, who was then the Duke of Ferrara, for his marble room. That was in 1520. It's the tale of two lovers told by Ovid, the philosopher of love, and he was Roman. Ariadne was abandoned by Theseus on the Isle of Naxos, but reunited with her true love, Bacchus, in the ultimate romantic myth that Titian constructed as a classical form. This is one of the great ironies in the history of painting, that romantic feeling can exist in the form of classicism. But irony should not be mistaken for cynicism. The first is within the realm of art, while the second exists somewhere outside, within the denial of despair, where everything sounds like one big joke. Thus, cynicism largely results from media saturation and is the desperate cousin of an uncertain market, where no criteria is present, only arrogance and superficial speculation. I'm going to move to something different, because we are talking about globalization and connoisseurship. And I'm going to show you 3 images from Isfahan. This is in front of the Great Mosque. I was the first American critic in over 30 years to be invited to Iran in 2007. I was invited on 2 occasions. I gave a talk, and I served on a jury to judge the work of 17 young sculptors. I repeated that 6 months later when I went back. The second time I returned, I had the great pleasure of meeting Hossein Mousavi through a colleague of mine, Baruch Daresh, who I met in Venice during the Biennial in 2003. You'll never hear this on Fox News, but Hossein Mousavi has translated Kandinsky and Klee from German into Farsi. He's an art historian by training who runs an art and cultural center that is extremely sophisticated, well-staffed, and extremely good in terms of its selection. Is limited pretty much to what is in Iran. Okay, this is in front of the mosque. These are probably images that most of you have not seen. I gotta say that when I saw this interior of the dome, among other tile works in the Blue Mosque of Esfahan, it took my breath away. And the only thing that I could mutter to myself is, the West is the leader of art? For the first time, maybe not for the first, maybe for the second or third, because I have been to Asia, but I was so moved by this. It was absolutely extraordinary. A guard who saw my response asked somebody who spoke English to translate. And he said, I will take you into a chamber that no non-Muslim has been in over 240 years. A chamber where the tiles have never been washed. I went in. It was breathtaking. I didn't dare pull out my camera, but it was breathtaking. The color, the craft, the insight in terms of the cosmos, just remarkable. Here we see another view. Before we were looking at the entryway. And I'm showing this in relation to a work by Baruz Daresh, who I met, as I mentioned, in Venice. They had a provisionary pavilion, 3 Iranian artists that were sponsored by the Tehran Mocha, and they were directly across from the old Palazzo Grassi, which is now the Pinot collection. And I visited there often. I wanted to understand these guys and talk with them. And I suppose that eventually led to my invitation, where I got a call at 3 o'clock in the morning because nobody had ever called the United States to know the time difference. Anyway, the title of this work on the right, I think it's difficult to see the further back in the room you are, but there are tiny cut-out metal pieces that are strung from the dome. Many of them are just suspended, so the currents of air will move them. They all have a figurative reference. Maybe not the full figure, maybe appendages, torsos, whatever. But they're all dangling underneath this dome. The title of the piece is Aporia. For those of you unfamiliar with aporia, it is a post-structural word. In classical rhetoric, aporia means placing a claim in doubt by developing arguments on both sides of an issue. In the terminology of deconstruction, aporia is a final impasse or paradox, the site at which the text most obviously undermines its own rhetorical structure, dismantles or deconstructs itself. This is a quote from Derrida. There are some extraordinary artists that I've written about in the Brooklyn Rail. One was on an article I did on structuralism in women artists, and I included the work of Mazda Karimizadeh, who is a great artist. I'll tell you something. This woman was in her early 30s. She did this helix out of compressed black foam that was more than 2 meters across and suspended. Holding the helix together were these needles about a foot long with tiny ceramic heads in white ceramic and glazed, so that the lights striking it were like constellations. There were over 200 of these pins holding the helix together. I discovered through Karimzadeh that maybe stars do not fill the sky, but maybe the electromagnetic currents of the stars hold the universe together. About 3 years later, I was at a conference in Munich, and there was a Ukrainian scholar who was teaching at Harvard at the time, showing the latest photographs from the Hubble telescope. And those photographs revealed exactly what I felt when I saw Karimzadeh's sculpture. So after the lecture, I went up and I asked them, I said, "Are you insinuating that these stars are all connected and that we're not seeing the way they really are by the naked eye?" And he says, "They're all connected." I discovered this through art and later through science. As Vladimir Nabokov once said in an interview with Maurice Girodias after the publication of Lolita, Girodias said, "Vladimir, what is art?" And Vladimir said, "Art is precision." Girodias cleared his throat. And he said, "Well, if art is precision, then what is science?" Vladimir Nabokov looked Girodias in the eye and said, "Science, my friend, is intuition." After another pause, Girodias said, "Excuse me, in all due respect, don't you have the two confused?" Nabokov was infuriated. He said, "No, I insist. Art is precision. Science is intuition." This is a work by a Los Angeles artist who I met maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I organized a show for him in Potsdam. I'm trying to remember exactly when that was. I believe it was around 2006. And we have stayed in touch more or less. But he had never seen the Pergamon in East Berlin. So we went over there, he and his wife and myself, and he was so taken by the Ishtar Gate. So he started making objects in which he had all the tiles measured exactly 50% scale. He was in contact with the curator for more than 2 years. And he built a Cadillac covered with the exact replication of these tiles from the Ishtar Gate. He built it out of wood, the frame, and then put on the tiles. Amazing. Well, his latest work is this cooling tower with images from the Ishtar Gate. It's called Ishtar Cooling Tower. And I thought of the quote from Derrida, "The site at which the text most obviously undermines its own rhetorical structure." This is a detail, and you can see how precise it is that Reynolds has constructed. Now, in all fairness to Reynolds, he works in a way that is very similar to Hans Hake's aesthetic, or for that matter, to the aporia of Baruch Daresh. He allows the work to speak in terms of itself, and the aporia simply unravels the code. He's not taking a position so much as showing a paradox. I can tell you from my experience, in my second visit to Tehran, sitting in the office of the director, Habibullah, I can't remember his last name, Karimzadeh, and Habibullah was saying, "This happens every week. He said, the lights went out for 2 hours. And I said, why? And he said, Professor Morgan, we have a population of 14 million people in Tehran. There isn't enough energy all the time for all the sectors of the city. And I thought that was interesting. So the meeting was canceled. We took a walk in the beautiful park, where there were some very wonderful giacomettis, by the way, outside of the museum. Then went back to the hotel, had dinner. That night, before our flight, because the flights always leave in the middle of the night, we went to a shopping mall, and again, the lights went out. And I was with my translator, because I have a book now. This is something I'm terribly proud of, I have to say. I'm the first American critic to have a book translated into Farsi and published now in Iran. For some reason, I enjoy that. And by the way, it happened exactly the same month as the Hebrew translation in Israel. I thought that was great. There's going to be an event in New York at some point where people are going to read, Iranians and Israelis, the two different texts in their own language, because I think the beginning of a meeting place between these two countries is hearing the other's language. That's the beginning. Okay. Anyway, again, I would have to say this is irony, not cynicism. This is within the province of art. This is as much irony as Thomas Rowlandson or Honoré Daumier, or for that matter, Goya. So what about politics, natural disasters, political disorders, including conflict and war? What does this have to do with connoisseurship? Are these omnipresent events somehow outside the realm of connoisseurship? One might say that connoisseurship is feared by power in that the historical, cultural, and aesthetic decoding of an object brings a certain liberation, which is exactly why Lenin, after living in Zurich, feared the Dadaists and feared the constructivists when he got back to Russia. Why is it that Göring's degenerate art exhibition at the Haus der Kunst in Munich in 1937 feared the most significant art in Germany at that time? And why is it that Mao's deeply cynical cultural revolution took 30 million lives and destroyed countless scrolls and treasured paintings in order to dispel any trace of China's past? Despite its will toward aggression and massive destruction, mindless power is fragile and especially hostile to genuine taste and pleasure. This is why pleasure, in the true sense, is still the most convincing and sustaining act of revolution, and why the goal of aesthetic connoisseurship is always directed toward pleasure in objects. And by the way, I realized after writing that it's almost directly out of Marcuse's wonderful book, The Aesthetic Dimension. I believe that was the last book that he published in 1979 or 1980. Okay, in 2009 I was invited to the International Women's Biennial in Incheon. This is the only women's biennial that I know of that is truly professional. The work was absolutely stunning, mostly by unknown or what is sadly called emerging artists. But the question came up in one of the panels: why is an International Women's Biennial important? Well, in some cases there were men that were showing, but the point is that all the curators, there were 3 of them, were women, and that the administration was entirely women. And my point was that there has to be at least one biennial in which this condition exists. It's interesting and it's important because it's a different kind of biennial than those that are immediately going to go to the art fairs and sell their wares. hopefully these women will have the same luck in terms of what I felt was 70% first-rate work. Now, this is, I do not have the name of the artist who did this, but the point is that some art is temporal, obviously. A lot of it has been since the Neo-Dada period of the 50s, and even before. I would argue, along with José Luis Sert, who was a Catalan architect, taught a number of years ago at MIT, that I remember a talk he gave in Cambridge where he was talking about a mural that was done on a window, and he was very pleased with the fact that it was going to be washed off the next day. But it existed for that time and that space. And I think there's something about that. They should not infringe on whether the work has superiority or doesn't. I want to show another work that is quite the opposite, which is not a temporally based work. This is bronze. It's by a Belgian sculptor living in Den Haag, the Netherlands. Her work provided for me an alternative to Krauss's essay from the late 70s, the sculpture in the expanded field. Because I realized that as I looked at this, which is a series, she always does these men that are very vulnerable in various positions and a little bit larger than life. But they're extraordinary in terms of the feeling that, that transmits from the work. And as I was looking at this, I realized that this is not Carl Andre, this is not Robert Morris, this is something very different. That since that essay was written, the computer has come aboard spaceship Earth. And cell phones have come aboard, and all manner of electronic devices, as those of us who teach unfortunately know. Also, and I think importantly, 9/11 had not occurred in the late 70s. So in looking at Beaumont's work, I said, yes, this is the new direction. She's dealing with psychological contraction as opposed to expansion in the field, which in fact is the truth of what has happened. That there is a new psychology that has evolved, a new way of seeing. The expanded field has perhaps gone into architecture, as we see in some of the works, for example, of Zaha Hadid, as I saw in Denmark 3 weeks ago, leaving the necessary point that sculpture can now come back to internal realities, but from a very different point of view than we saw in the past. There is feeling in this work, and I would like to quote from Collingwood, Robin Collingwood, from 1938. This struck me, and I think that it's completely relevant to what I felt when I looked at her retrospective in Den Haag, outside of Den Haag. Feeling appears to arise in us independently of all thinking, in a part of our nature which exists and functions below the level of thought and is unaffected by it. All that we have said about it and all that anybody can ever speak about it is of course discovered or misdiscovered by the activity of thought. But thought seems, in this case, simply to discover what was there independently of it, almost as if we were thinking about the anatomical structure and functioning of our body, which would no doubt exist and go on whether we thought about it or not. Anyway, the mind-body connection, I think, is relevant. I don't know if you can see this painting. It's by Cho Shi-hwa. It's called Untitled Number 8. He is a Chinese artist that I met for the first time in Venice in 2001 through Harold Zeman. And I have to say that if you have not seen the exhibition at Chambers Fine Art of this artist, who's showing with a younger artist, by the way, it's extraordinary work. I went to Choshi's studio in Beijing, and we spent literally the entire afternoon. There are as many as 40 coats of paint in primary colors on the canvas. He's dealing with oil, not ink, but he's transliterating the experience of ink as he remembers from Northern Song Dynasty paintings in his mind onto the canvas. And he thins the primary colors so that they are almost, or maybe they are, invisible. But he is absolutely matching not only the subject matter, but the brushwork on this rather large canvas. I saw his exhibition at the former Italian Pavilion, as I mentioned, in 2001. I was so taken by it. And I hope that he will have a major show, I mean, shown in China, obviously, in Shenzhen primarily. But we are trying to organize an exhibition in Shanghai because that has a larger international community. And I am very, very taken by this idea that is merging with visual, whether it's invisible or visible, it's still a tactile object that is there. This suggests something that Aldous Huxley pointed out a number of years ago, that seeing, the act of seeing, depends on memory, meaning to say, there is no separation between how we perceive and how we conceive. They're inextricably bound to one another. This, by Cho Shi-hwa, Untitled 8, is conceptual awareness in the act of painting. Choshi, by the way, is 70 years old and has been doing this for 40 years. The manner in which we receive a work of art is an appellation toward beauty and fulfillment. By the way, I want to show you one of the paintings that Cho Shi-hwa admires by a 10th century Northern Song master by the name of Chujan. And this is probably the signature work from that period. And this is when the painter monks were wandering in the mountains and painting what they felt in relation to what they saw. It is the spirit, or the chi, that they are attempting to pull out of the mountain. While mediocrity in art makes for an aggressive market, connoisseurship takes time. Il est temps. Significant art makes us reflect as it heightens the process of sensory cognition through feeling. It refers to a learning, emotional, sensory, and finally, a total experiential process. The combination of these factors is what makes exemplary art original. This is an Indonesian artist living in Bali. And the photograph was taken in 2003. His name is Mari Wianta. I did an exhibition of he and a Japanese artist by the name of Kuma, Kishiyumi Shonebara, at the Mike Weiss Gallery in 2005. My point of doing this show, by the way, is to show that hemispheres are not only east and west, that even in Asia, as in the Americas, there is a north and south. I have to say that often Americans forget about the south, and often the Japanese forget about Indonesia. But anyway, both directions, or all directions, I should say, are important. One comment. Well, I feel that Madi Wianta's work is somewhere between the visible and the invisible, between form and experience, between mind and emotions. As we were driving around one day, we went to a Hindu temple. The Hindus came to Bali more than 3,000 years ago and built temples at the 4 cardinal points, and then a millennium later did temples between the 4 cardinal points. So there are 8 Hindu temples surrounding the island of Bali. Anyway, it seems as though some people who build things or design things, developers, came to Bali and they wanted a certain property in which one of these temples existed. They were going to build a high-rise glass and steel hotel because it was near the area of Nusa Dua, which is the beach area that's near the capital, which is Denpasar. Anyway, the point is, they said, why do you want this temple? It's old, and there's not even a roof. Anyone who has been to a Hindu temple knows that there's no roof. The whole point is that your head is open to the sky, okay, where God exists, all right? But this was their argument. There's no roof, therefore we're going to destroy it and build our glass and steel skyscraper. Well, fortunately, and this is very unusual, I mean, it's not unusual for Bali, but unusual for other places, they voted it down and they wouldn't permit the developer to destroy the temple. This reminds me of the argument that has been going on ever since TWA left the terminal that Eero Saarinen designed at JFK back in the early 60s. Somebody said, well, we'll leave the facade. And I said, there is no facade. That's the whole point of the architecture. Well, it's the old story of where we are with the market. If there is no aesthetic understanding, there are only names and prices that float in the astral vacuum of God knows what. I'm interested in coordinating. Oh, this, by the way, is a wonderful event that Madi Wianta did. He's a sculptor and painter, but this was done in a quarry in which he placed these bamboo poles and lit them. And in the evening, it was just absolutely stunning. And the weather was nice enough so that people could, eat, and because there was food there, and it was just a magical experience. I think Wianta is absolutely a great artist. Anyway, I'm contradicting what I said at the beginning of my talk, but anyway. Let me just say this as a closing remark. I'm interested in coordinating the virtual extensions of everyday reality, the invisible within the visible, while restoring belief in a tactile relationship with people and objects. While the projection of the virtual appears inevitable throughout the entertainment and news media, it is a kind of seduction that tends toward power and addiction. This suggests a loss of balance that ignores the necessity of feeling fundamental aspects of human reality. Feelings are tied to tactile experience in one form or another, even though arbitration, as in some works of art, even in arbitration as in some works of art. In other words, I think in certain cases, I'm thinking of Franz Erhard Walter in particular, I think that the arbitration that the body belongs in there is an interesting idea. And I'm talking about these felt folds that he creates on these large kind of monochromatic tapestries. For example, it is possible to think through touch in the process of living and working in our technocracy. In other words, I think that we have to regain the sense that our hands are thinking, okay? Even in relation to technologies of various kinds. However, as humans progress further along, the limits of the virtual will become more transparent as prescribed automatic applications may function in conflict with how people actually live. And of course, we've been seeing signs of this for some time. This becomes further complicated if the extreme economic differences between people continue to evolve, presumably to the benefit of a hierarchical minority. While there is a certain logic in this, there are also limitations as to what human beings will find available in the future that will give them happiness and fulfillment in their lives. There will be no advance in the relationship between the quality of life and advanced technology as long as primary emphasis is given to speculation and on money to be made. I'll repeat that one more time. There will be no advance in the relationship between the quality of life and advanced technology as long as primary emphasis is given to speculation on money to be made. If this inevitability should appear to change, it will be felt before it is consciously realized. It will happen not through revolution, but through a type of atavism brought on by a recognition of the need for tactile experience instigated within the realm of the virtual. In this sense, connoisseurship in art will have already shifted to another level, perhaps to a more Eastern reality, where the emphasis will be less on the division between the conceptual and the material aspects of form than on the energy within the material syntax of form. We cannot continue to confuse blind materialism with the quality of life, nor should we confuse the quality of works of art with their media value or auction value. As the 21st century evolves, these values will no longer be contiguous. The cause will no longer match the effect, and finally, we will no longer exist in the same world that once was. To rediscover this contiguity, we will need to relearn how our brains function in relation to our tactile sensations, and how tactile sensations can open up a process of cognition that we can share with others. In other words, a dialogue about ourselves and about art, what the great Hasidic scholar Martin Buber called a dialogical encounter. For this to happen, things have to come down a bit. Slowness as a mental state is what is required to engage in any process that involves qualitative judgments. Therefore, all good art will continue to take time, and time will take energy, and energy will improve our quality of life and our way of seeing and thinking about art. Thank you.